Well, good morning once again, friends. Well, good to be with you this morning, and good to be worshiping with you, and have the privilege of sharing the sermon with you. And for some that I have not met, and there are some that I did just meet this morning, again, my name is Lisi Schröttner, and I'm one of the pastors here at Wildwood Mennonite Church. And I want to begin by saying thank you to Margaret for reading the passage. She did rightly come up to me before the service and say, "What are you going to do with that first line there?" And I want to go back there. Where is it? Okay. Oops. That line, but the snake was even more naked. Has anyone ever heard this interpretation of this text? Is that new for some of you? All right, yeah, it was new for me too, actually, when I was choosing the version to have read for this morning. And this does tie into what I will be saying in a few minutes. But I just want to say that the Hebrew wordplay in these chapters is just excellent, and that's notable in Genesis chapter 2 and 3. So the word naked and the word for crafty and cunning is actually very similar. It's basically a vowel difference. One is a room, one's a roam. So I like how the interpreters of this version did play on that a little bit. So kudos to them, and I'm glad that we heard that read this morning. And there's other wordplay that I won't get into, but there's lots there. But this morning, we're gathered around the theme of beginnings, as Teresa said earlier. The themes of creation and creation myths, origins and origin stories. Has anyone ever asked you, or have you ever heard this question asked, what's your origin story? Well, my origin story, and I won't get into too much, begins in the foothills of the Austrian Alps, where two people met, two people got married, actually in that church right over there. Those were my parents. And then a couple years after that, they moved, immigrated, they went on a grand adventure to the land of Canada, and here I am today. That's the beginning of my origin story. My ancestors are from this land, from those mountains. And now I'm here in Canada. And part of my origin story as well is that 28 years after that, I went to the University of British Columbia and studied, guess what language? Hebrew. And that's how I got into being really excited about Hebrew wordplay. So that is also a key part of my origin story, and one of the reasons why I like to share it when I'm at the pulpit. So that's part of my story, how I got to this place. Now things make sense, right? Now you can understand a little bit more about who I am and where I come from. Now, if you were to talk about origin stories, this term today, it's probably in the context of superheroes and comic books. Origin stories are a core part of understanding characters, really in any story. How did this superhero get her powers? What happened in their childhood? What happened to this bad guy that made him want to destroy the world? What's her backstory? Again, an origin story helps us understand a character and sheds light on the narrative as we're experiencing it. A backstory is key to understanding how one got to where they are. And saying this, you can see how a backstory is key for both an individual and a collective group of people. We, as a collective, have a backstory as well. Like a family, understanding the circumstances and the journey of a group of people helps those who encounter them know where they're coming from. And while some communal stories are not as exciting as superhero stories, I don't know about you, but no one in my family was bit by a radioactive spider, and no one was trained as deadly spies for the Soviet Union. So, things are not as exciting as that. But our community stories, whether it's family or a nation, these stories of the past illuminate the present and the future. And of course, origin stories include myths. Myths are traditional stories that are told over and over and over again. Not because they're necessarily factual, but at their essence, they contain a kernel of truth, a message of truth, a message that perseveres for years, from decades to thousands of years. So another kind of origin story is the creation myth. How did we get here? What events and characters shaped the world as we know it? So last week here, Joe introduced us to the Hebrew creation myth in Genesis, which begins the story of belonging. The Hebrew creation myth, as we have it in Genesis, is a written transcript of oral history, the stories passed down through families, through generations. Scholars believe the story was written during the time of exile later in Babylon, a challenging time when compiling stories and composing these myths was part of their identity formation. Some of the literature in the Old Testament, including the histories, wisdom poetry, prophetic proclamations, they all contribute to this formation of identity in a challenging time. Some of this literature, historical. Some of it, mythical. And our job this morning isn't to decide what's historical, what's factual, or what's the stuff of myth and legend. Our job here is to find the meaning and figure out what this origin story is telling us about the characters. And those characters include the divine, the God of the Hebrews, the ground of being who transcends time and space and speaks our world into being as much now as they did then. So what is the meaning and legacy of the creation story, and particularly this scene that follows, our focus for today? Genesis 2 and 3 particularly, the fall as it's been known, or how they name it in the Book of Belonging, the Garden of Forgotten Names. Well, the Garden of Forgotten Names has been interpreted in many ways and has been the origin story of many theologies and ideologies across time. Its interpretation has led to both harm and healing. In the Christian imagination, over centuries, this has been the origin story for sin and evil entering the world. It's been the origin story for the devil, snake equals Satan or the devil. And it is, unfortunately, one of the origins for the subjugation of women, to name a few theologies and ideologies. Ideas like this being the first sin were already prevalent in Bible times, as we see in the New Testament, but I have to say, some of these schools of thought come much later and are not biblical, and we have to thank theologians like Augustine of Hippo for that. Augustine. The ideas of things like original sin or inherited sin, and again, that focus on women being lesser than men, is usually later theology, but won't get into that today. Today we're looking at this story through the lens that the Bible of Belonging, this book that Dawn read from and that we're going through this season, we'll use the lens that comes up in here. And that is this one of the phrases that encapsulates what this book, how this Bible is portrayed and written. That God's names for you are true, you belong, you are beloved, you are delightful. These ideas of names and belonging are the threads that will follow through this series and the journey that we'll take throughout this year. From Genesis to Revelation, we'll follow the story of the people that God goes with, whether it's the Hebrews or the early Christians, as they remember their true names, as they forget their true names and remember them again, and as they live into their identity, as they live into their truest selves, as those who belong, are loved, and delighted in and by the Creator. In the story of the garden here in Genesis 3, we read the origin story of how we came to forget our true names, our truest selves, and the consequences of this forgetting. So the human beings, they were in that good garden that God created, and all was well. There were boundaries, as we hear, of course, where they had to get their food, which tree to eat from, which tree not to eat from, but they were safe. They were innocent. They were connected. And then that shift happens. The human beings learn that things might not be what they seem. They are told that something is being kept from them. So the first thing they lose or forget is trust and the safety that comes with that. The snake makes them doubt what God had told them. And it's interesting in the text, the woman even seems to change the directives from God, from changing a don't eat to a don't even touch or you will die. Then as we go along in the text, here comes the enticing part. You can be like God, having all knowledge. This phrase that pops up, the knowledge of good and evil, or variations of that in Genesis 2 and 3, is a particular phrase. It's a rhetorical device in which two opposites are placed together to show totality, so the breadth of an idea. It's like when we read from the heavens to the earth. It's those two opposites and everything in between. So it's showing totality. So in this place, when it talks about the knowledge of good and evil, it's talking about the totality of all things that can be known, good, evil, and everything in between. So what an enticing offer to know all of that. So when they eat the fruit and their eyes are opened, it's as if they pressed fast forward, as we heard in the children's story. They suddenly have all that knowledge. Instead of the slow process of growing and learning and walking with their Creator, they earn it on their own. From child to adult in the blink of an eye, or with that bite of that fruit. So the second thing they lose, first is trust, second is innocence. The childlike wonder and trust and joy is gone, and the real world suddenly hits them. As one commentator writes, the primal couple have left the magical garden of childhood innocence and entered into the harsh, real world of adulthood and its painful realities. This move away from innocence has led some scholars to interpret the Genesis 3 story as one of sexual maturity. It's not necessarily a story that introduces sin into the world, but rather it describes how the ancient people understood that shift from childhood to adulthood. And it introduces procreation as part of creating a legacy, as part of creating that immortality. And I think that's certainly part of that, the meaning behind this story, and there's a lot of interesting work on that concept. So the humans have lost their innocence. In shame, the humans hide from the one who calls them beloved. So the third thing lost is connection. That holistic shalom, this idea of peace that connects us, this holistic well-being and connection with all that's around us. A barrier has been put up between them and their Creator, and likely them and creation around them. We heard that in the children's story. They're afraid of the animals around them. In different renderings of this story, and here's another story, but called The Blessing Seed, about creation. And just down there in the corner, you can read, Adam saying, "Why did the animals run away from us?" And I know this is also from animated Bible story videos that I grew up watching. Whenever they bite into that fruit, darkness comes in, the storm clouds come, and there's this fear that rises. You watch in those scenes in the scramble to sew fig leaves together to hide their nakedness. The humans, they keep that watchful eye out for animals. And, every time the grass rustles, they sort of twitch and turn around and look for what is now dangerous. As the story goes, then that rustle is God, taking a stroll in the evening breeze, which I just love that phrase, and it's a nice picture to have. But God is walking through the garden, and the humans, they hide in shame. God asks, "Where are you?" And there's a lot in that question. In shame, the humans, they share their reason for hiding, and they start that blame game, right? The man says it was the woman says it was the snake. But in essence, they're blaming the one who created them all. Essentially, God, it's your fault. So what was once a deep connection is now broken. So we have trust, innocence, connection. When these are lost, what are the consequences? Well, in the following verses from Genesis 3:14-24, which we didn't hear this morning, but the consequences for each of these characters is laid out, and which characterize how the world is experienced from this point on. And what's true of their experience? Suspicion, guilt, and disconnection between everyone and everything. So at the end of the chapter, Adam and Eve, they leave the garden, the place they know, and they embark on a journey to take that knowledge, that fullness of what they know, good, evil, and everything in between, and learn how to walk in wisdom, walking with God. I like how in the story that Don read, you can be smart but not wise. So I think it's a shift from being smart, having all this knowledge, but how to use that knowledge in wisdom. So they embark on this journey, relearning how to live into their true names of belonging, beloved, and delightful. And here's how two Jewish biblical scholars sum up this story. Amy Jill Levine is a Jewish scholar of the New Testament and Old Testament, and her partner in this book, Mark Brettler, sum up the story this way. Most significant for later interpretations, the word sin is absent from this story. Instead, the story describes how people become both sexually aware and mortal. Like many stories of origin, it explains how the world as we know it came into being. But this new reality, according to Genesis 2 and 3, is not a state of alienation from God. God is outside the garden, with Adam and Eve, and with their descendants. God is outside the garden. God goes with them. I don't know about you, but hearing this story as a child, that's never emphasized. There's a sense of alienation from God. God is still in the garden. You see the cherubs with their flaming swords and just darkness everywhere else, and Adam and Eve just trudging away to go out into the wide, scary world. But God goes with. God is not confined to that garden. So that's what I love about this quote here. It's a good reminder of that. So with that in mind, and with our themes of the Book of Belonging together, this myth or this origin story can be understood as the moment in human history when we lost something of our original created selves. When we decided to take control, our eyes were opened, and we were faced with the full realities of the human experience, good and evil and everything in between. But as these authors point out, this is also the start of a beautiful journey to reclaim what was lost or forgotten, and a journey with God. So with this framework, what are the invitations for us today? Well, I'd like to just take a moment to read in this Book of Belonging one of the mindful moments. We had a few, or at least one last week, when we first read from Genesis. So I'll just read from this page here, this mindful moment, and then spend a moment in reflection before we carry on. So don't worry, I'll read it out. You're not expected to read that fine print. So Eve and Adam trusted the untrue names that the snake suggested more than they trusted God's good names for them. It seems to be part of our humanity to sometimes trust untrue names. And what we believe about who we are matters. It changes the way we act. That is why it's so important to know and trust God's names for us. Learning to trust God takes time. We need to learn who God is and what God's voice sounds like and what God's Spirit feels like. Throughout this whole book, you will learn many different names for God and many different names that God calls you. So let's remember some of those names. So I invite you to close your eyes and take some deep belly breaths. Then put your hand over your heart like you're pressing on a name tag. Repeat these names. I am loved. I belong with God. I am good. I am purposed. I am treasured. I am honored. I am never alone. I am protected. We learn to trust these names as we grow to know and trust God. And who is God? Well, that is something we spend our whole lives learning. God is so big and wonderful that none of our words can quite describe God. But here are some names that describe parts of God. Creator, gracious, merciful, patient, loving Father, good shepherd, helper, strong tower, mother hen, gentle dove, birthing mama, peace, rescuer. So So you're invited to carry those names, those I am statements. Carry those for yourself. Hold them close to your heart like a name tag, and remember those, and those names for God too. But as I said in the beginning, what we're reflecting on today is important for our collective identity and our collective journey as well. Origin stories of our past have implications for our present and future. So in an extended sort of second mindful moment, I want us to reflect on our current reality and what these truths mean for us and how we relate to one another. So let's go back to that garden, to that space before God invites us on that journey. Sometimes we remain in that space in the garden where we've forgotten how to trust. We've lost innocence and our lives remain disconnected, at odds with everything around us. Sometimes we remain in that garden, hidden behind those hastily stitched fig leaves and among the trees. We're hiding from our Creator and the goodness of creation and each other. This space shapes how we interact with others, and I'm sure we can all imagine what it looks like when we interact from that space, when we're in a space of distrust, doubt, shame, fear, and disconnect even with our truest selves. And that disconnect leads us to treat others in the same way, with distrust, doubt, shame, and fear. In this moment, we're seeing great fractures in relationships, those close to home and abroad, because we're not being honest about how this affects us. We're living out of those false names. This happens in families, communities, in nations, and all groups that we're part of. As a group, whether it's a family or a nation, we have perpetuated narratives and names that we live by. And in the collective experience, this can be great for creating a collective sense of identity. I feel like we're never going to forget the elbows up and all that that has meant and means for us, whether good or bad. So in the collective experience, again, that can be great for creating this collective sense of identity. But we all know equally, perpetuated narratives and names create a collective sense of who is not part of us. Who is the other? Sometimes our origin stories alienate others, and unless we confront those legacies and speak the truth about them, that distance will continue to grow and sow distrust, doubt, shame, and fear. So many people are afraid to confront these truths, especially those of us who carry power and privilege. So we continue to operate in this space, again, hiding behind those hastily gathered fig leaves and propped up by names that don't reflect our truest self. In those moments when God or loved ones or prophets call out, "Where are you? Why are you hiding?" Can we honestly answer and allow ourselves to be seen, truly seen, and welcomed back on the journey of knowing who we truly are? So in all the diverse interpretations of these myths of Genesis, there are certain truths that remain constant. And these are words you're going to hear over and over again, I think, as we go through this storybook Bible. We are made to belong. We are beloved by the Creator, and we are delightful. We are all made in the image of God. So what if we saw everyone like this? What if we reminded others of these truths for themselves? What if we reminded others of their truest selves? What if we affirmed everyone's inherent belovedness first before calling them other names? And what if love looks like naming the harms that someone has caused as individuals and as groups? Love is speaking truth to power and reminding the powers that be that everyone is worthy of life and dignity and love, including them. Maybe this is done in protest. Maybe this is done in time spent together. As I mentioned earlier this week, we hosted a breakfast and a worship gathering here for the week of prayer for Christian unity. So there were Anabaptist Mennonites, Roman Catholics, Lutherans, United Church folk, all gathered in this space to worship together. During the reflection, our executive minister, Len Rempel, shared a brief reflection on Ephesians 4, which was the theme verse, or theme chapter, I guess, and he began his reflection with the theme of enemies. Even if you don't in your head name people as enemies or think of people that way, can you imagine someone that you disagree with? Someone you are at odds with? Find yourself on an opposite side of a political or ideological spectrum. Now imagine they're sitting in this space right next to you, and you're having a conversation. What would it be like to even invite them in this space, this sacred and safe space, and have someone that you disagree with, someone you can consider an enemy? And what does it mean to spend time to get together? What would it be like to sit under this banner that says you belong and looking them in the face and saying you belong? What would that look like? Again, our job is to remind people of their inherent belovedness and to show love and speak truth to power. Again, maybe that's done in a conversation or over a meal. Maybe that's done in protest on the city streets. Maybe that's done in gentle reminders. Reminders that bring people back to their origin story, reminding them of who they are and how they are part of a story of belonging and belovedness and delight. So may we draw others into that beautiful truth as we take this journey together through the wide, wild world. And as we dream together of a world where childlike innocence is protected and all are safe and connected. May we all remember that this is our story, this is our calling. So friends, in this moment with these stories, may we stay tender, may we stay fierce as we proclaim this good news in the world that desperately needs it. Amen.